Our story for today begins. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. You would think that's not a particularly important detail, especially given that the story contains the line like the one on the front of your bulletins today. Not surprisingly, the internet is divided about who coined the term location, location, location to describe the most important thing in a real estate transaction. It's probably stuck around, at least in part, because where you are really matters to who you are and your story, and we all intuitively know that. The lines that humans draw to mark out territory can lead to strange and sometimes disastrous consequences. The decision this week to sign the peace accord between Eritrea and Ethiopia this week meant that parents were reunited with children for the first time in 20 years. People had simply been on the move when the war started, and that was it. You were stuck. Of all the lines in the story for today, the first appears to be the most inconsequential, but it is in fact a critical piece of the story. No more or less important to the telling of an American story and identifying whether the subject is in Maine or Montana. Archaeological excavations have confirmed that the center of the villages of Caesarea Philippi, there was a shrine dedicated to the Greek god Pan. In the next chapter of Mark, Jesus will ascend a mountain, likely Mount Hermon, which overshadows Caesarea Philippi, and there he will be transfigured. It is a place in the gospel where the divine blessing upon Jesus, it is at its most profound and pronounced. And the locals there will have known Mount Hermon as also a place of shrines dedicated to gods who were thought to dwell there, including Pan. After Jesus finishes on the mountain, he will come back down to the villages, and there he will see a distressed father who complains to Jesus that his son is racked by seizures. We typically view this as an episode of a child struck by epilepsy, but it may have been something closer to speaking in tongues, because the physical manifestation of the god Pan was supposed to occur by seizing children so that they were put out of their minds as adult believers prayed and prophesied. This is from where we derive our word panic. In other words, in this place in particular, when in our reading for today Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" it isn't a question asked in a vacuum, but in a community that has a long and rich history of pagan ritual worship. Now, I promise today will not be an archaeology or history lesson for a sermon, but I thought if I'm going to talk about Pan, I would at least put a picture of him up on the screen. He was the god of the wild, god of the shepherds and flocks, god of nature, and the god of rustic music. We've perhaps heard of panpipes. There it is. He has the hindquarters, legs, and horns of a goat, and there he is teaching a shepherd how to play his pipes. He appeared on coins as early as the 4th century BCE. The religious background is not the only way in which Caesarea Philippi was important to this story, though. In the time of Jesus, Jews and Gentiles lived in the area together as the Romans increasingly placed more importance on that community in particular. Close to Caesarea Philippi, a temple had been built and dedicated to Augustus by Herod the Great. Now, around the time that the Gospel of Mark was being finalized, in the late 60s, remember, Jesus is alive and his ministry occurs perhaps in the late 20s. The Gospel of Mark is composed, edited, finalized in the late 60s, possibly being written in Caesarea Philippi itself. Jews were coming there from the south in the wake of the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. Waves of migrants who had suffered a brutally repressive revenge operation by the Romans beginning in 66 were starting to arrive in Caesarea Philippi in the north. This rebellion in the late 60s is one of the most important events in understanding the context of the New Testament. In the time of Jesus, again around the year 25 to 30 or so, the temple is still the center of Jewish religious life. And while things certainly aren't calm with the Romans, full-scale rebellion has yet to take place. After Jesus' ministry, the Roman hunger for tax revenue continues, And that prompts protests by Jews against those taxes, which are increasingly suffocating their people. And so the Jews retaliate, and attacks on Roman citizens increase in Judea. The Roman governor responds by plundering the Jewish temple, claiming the money for the empire. This then prompts a large-scale rebellion, and the Roman military garrison of Judea is quickly overrun by rebels, while the pro-Roman king Herod Agrippa II flees Jerusalem. The army from the north is called in to assist, and the Romans slowly and steadily and viciously put down the revolt, eventually laying siege to Jerusalem, destroying the temple in the year 70. The Arch of Titus, built in the year 82, still stands in Rome, honoring that destruction and celebrating taking the spoils of Jerusalem. As you can see, it is the inspiration for other arches celebrating victories. It looks familiar, does it not? Those escaping Jerusalem and coming north to a place like Caesarea Philippi would have borne the horrors of seeing the center of Jewish religious life annihilated. And it is in this context that the Gospel of Mark takes its final shape sometime around the year 70. And so refugees come north bearing these scars, and what do they find when they get there in Caesarea Philippi? An early Christian community with a text or texts that is surfacing among Jews and Gentiles, whose memory of Jesus is one that has him asking, "Who do you say that I am?" And his disciples answer, "You are the Messiah." And then as they continue to hear this story, which Izumi read this morning, they will take note of verse 31, which says, "Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering." As refugees run away from the destruction of Jerusalem, they hear that a cornerstone of this Christian movement that is underway at the time is that the Messiah has already come and, like them, suffered too. That the Savior not just knows their pain and their lot in life and their suffering, but that Jesus' very own story will include talking to the people and ultimately being rejected by the people, the Roman occupation leaders, in Jesus' case, Pontius Pilate and Herod Antipas, that have ruined their own lives and their own communities. And so the teaching in Mark 8 goes in a particular order for the people in and around Caesarea Philippi. Some who have worshipped Pan, some who have seen a temple dedicated to Augustus go up in recent memory, and some who will have come from Jerusalem having witnessed ruin. That he, not Caesar, is the Messiah. That suffering will ensue for him because he too is in opposition to the values of the empire. And that to follow in this way, the people must deny the self. Those who want to save their lives will ultimately lose them. That they will find in the values of the Messiah a different set of priorities and values that are set against the backdrop of not just the values of the empire, but the empire that has stolen from them and burned their center of religious expression to the ground. This isn't just a tweaking of priorities. It isn't just a nibbling a little bit around the edges, but is a clear indicator of what the earliest Christian communities believed the definition of the good news to be. What is gospel? For early Christians, it was simply that Christ is Messiah and Caesar is not and never will be. And if that is true, what does it mean for them? And if that's true, what does it mean for us? The early Christian communities, their memory of Jesus is one that demands that a centering question become, if pagan religion has brought misery to our children, and if the Romans were able to come and ruin our lives by might and sword and shield, what then has priority? Is it to fight fire with fire? Is it to gain the world and forfeit our values? What is success? What is victory? What is the bedrock of life? David Brooks once said that we all have at least a couple of sides to our character. They're frequently expressed by us in our culture, by all of us in our culture. That all Americans, all modern-day Americans, have a resume side and a eulogy side to our characters. The resume side seeks success in career, accomplishments, getting stuff done. The eulogy side describes our character. What will people say about us? Were we bold? Were we trustworthy? Were we dependable? Were we any fun? And of course, when asked, most people will say that the values present at the eulogy are far more important, while also living their lives as if the resume outweighs everything else. Rabbi Abraham Soloveitchik said that this means that we are at war within ourselves because the resume side of our character is not immoral. The resume side gets you up in the morning, connects you with the market, the meritocracy. It gets you to ask how something works, what you can get someone to do for you or with you. This is expressed as delegation or teamwork. It moves the world forward in critical ways. The eulogy side of us offers an opposite logic that says that we have to give to receive and identifies with Jesus' not just suggestion, but instruction that you have to lose your life in order to gain it. That you have to discover that by letting go of ego, you gain anything and everything. That's why all the sermonizing and all the teaching about just letting go of your ego is so challenging, I imagine, and probably easy to ignore. Yes, I can let go of my ego and the market and the drive to do things, but we all know that those things can save lives. Are medical researchers ego-less? In some circles, the idea that surgeons are surgeons because they don't have egos would be considered high comedy. And so how are you going to lose your life to save it as you wrestle with the eulogy and the resume all at the same time? How are you going to allow a resume and a eulogy to exist within you? Can they ever be the same thing? I'd argue that we're only at war within ourselves when we see these things as competition. That the whole point is that to be a whole person, to incorporate in a healthy, loving, holistic way all facets of ourself, we recognize that to deny self is to simply deny that we are self entirely separate, on an island all by ourselves, separate from family, from others, from relationship, that we belong to ourselves, or that our purpose in life is to be a self-starter, to be self-sufficient, self-made, self-securing, because by their very nature, those things lead to isolation. And there is few things more dangerous for us as human beings than isolation. Isolation, putting up real boundaries, gates, walls, while seeking to make us secure, can also make us very afraid. And look, my first home with Stacy, our first home when we got married, was a tiny patio home in Arizona, which for some reason, and I have no idea why, was behind 2 security gates. You'd be hard-pressed to know if it was there to keep the poor folks out or to keep the poor folks in, given the state of my bank account when I was 25 years of age. But the gates didn't keep anybody out. There was always a way to get in. There was always a way around. Someone would learn the code or buzz their friends in or just wait until a resident drove in and they'd tailgate behind them. If you wanted in badly enough, you got in. But I'd argue it did something to the residents. We could pretend we were on an island, all to ourselves, separate from the world. An oasis, people would call it. Gates and walls and isolation breed isolation and fear. Ultimately, in the end, they breed violence because the other is always alien. What does it mean to lose yourself in order to gain your life? It always starts with a recognition of where our limits lie. The self taken alone does not have the resources or the capacity to make a good life. It will not work even if all the consumer ads tell us to have life and live it for ourselves. You cannot have the life you want that way. But at the center of life, instead, is a God of generosity that offers a life centered on thanksgiving and giving that away constantly. A God of generosity who is hope and calls us to be a hope for each other. A God of generosity that marks us with the waters of baptism that leads us to know that our life is safely and well held by God, who loves us more than we can even love ourselves. The crush of to-do lists and things, the pressure on our priorities, the constant calls for our attention to pay attention, they won't, can't, they will never end. And so may you this week remember your call to be a hope by beginning each day with gratitude. Gratitude that Jesus is Messiah and Caesar is not. Gratitude for life, love, family, and friends. Gratitude for the creation, for all that life can be. Gratitude for the very lesson present here, that you will gain your life when you lose yourself in gratitude for God's gifts. You absolutely will. You will gain your life when you lose yourself in gratitude for God's gifts. Your life will change. You will come closer to the way that Jesus taught. That may not sound like much, but as we follow that way, we come to learn together that actually it is everything. May God's peace be with you all.